The main theme is somewhat against, or at least pre a Weberian bureaucracy kind of stage. Weber had this picture of bureaucracy as a policy-making, policy-implementation institution that operated under broad, general, objective rules and applied them fairly efficiently. I'm going to be talking about economic governance, which is and in fact the deficiencies of economic governance that exist in many countries, because the process either does not have rules that are objective or does not strictly abide by such rules as it should. So this is a situation where policy making has a lot of arbitrary aspects, a lot of uncertainty, and that creates problems. Governance has become kind of a buzzword, and everybody uses it for his own purpose. And I'm going to be using it in the meaning of an institution or an organization whose purpose is to back up economic transactions by protecting property rights and enforcing contracts. That, of course, is obviously essential for any kind of moderately sophisticated economic activity to proceed. Without it, we'll not be able to get any capital accumulation, including things like improvement of land, because people will be afraid that the property that they're creating or improving will be taken from them. It will not lead to production specialization, because production specialization usually requires investing in some kind of specific asset, and if those assets are not secure, that will not happen. Much of the trade in goods and services might grind to a halt, because almost all trade is not a strictly spot one in which everything is cleared out at once, but there is some uncertainty about quality or some uncertainty about payment, requires writing and enforcing a contract, and if that contract is not enforceable, then that's problematic. Usually we think of governance as being provided by a state or a government which has a system of laws and their enforcement for protecting property and enforcing contracts. But there are other institutions as well, a whole lot of social institutions involving networks, norms, how one behaves in relationships, and penalties for those who do not abide by those norms. So there's a whole mix of those kind of institutions. And the quality of these institutions, governmental or non-governmental, and the mix between governmental and non-governmental varies widely across countries, varies widely across times. Broadly speaking, it's true that the more advanced an economy, the more its institutions of governance will be toward the formal end. But even in quite advanced economies, relationship-based governance, network-based governance still retains an important role. But whatever it is, it's almost never perfect. And I'll say a little bit more about that. We just have to accept that. And formal governance in particular is quite defective in less developed countries and in transition economies which haven't yet got the experience, haven't yet got all the mechanisms in place, etc. Of course, this affects domestic investors and traders as well, but the foreign ones are particularly at risk because they don't have equal access to really even those defective institutions. They don't have equal access to the political institutions, and sometimes actually for governments it's quite attractive to trample on foreigners' rights by saying, hey, we are looking after our own people, and if we rob these foreign firms who are investing, all well and good, and they might get political support for doing that. So this creates problems. It creates problems for trade, foreign firms who are trading, but also even more for foreign firms who are investing, foreign direct investment in your country. for two reasons. One is that investment involves a whole stock of capital that you're putting in, rather than just a 3-month or year flow of goods or services that you might be giving out. If you send out goods on spec and get cheated, you don't send anymore, and what you've lost is 3 months worth of goods. If you set up a plan, then that gets expropriated one way or the other. It doesn't have to be direct expropriation. It could be a sudden jump in taxes, it could be restriction on repatriation of profits, all those kind of things. Your whole capital stock is gone. So there's a stock versus flow problems. And the second is that between any firm and the government, an investment is a much more one-off event. There are not so many repetitions going on. And so the usual kind of self-enforcing, repeated relationship governance that might work for trade is less likely to work for investment. So governance of investment is often quite problematic. I just want to show you, to give you an idea of what kind of problems that exist by giving a very crude measure of the quality of economic governance in my sense. The World Bank publishes 6 indicators of governance. And I put 3 of them that are most relevant for the kind of thing I'm talking about: protection of property and enforcement of contracts, the quality of regulation, rule of law, and corruption. The other 3 are somewhat more political. There are things like voice and accountability, political stability, and government effectiveness, which is more a measure of outcomes than of process. But anyway, even if those were included, you would get fairly similar results. What I did was to take these 3 indicators, which for 212 countries, the World Bank puts them on a percentage scale, and average them over 3 years. And so they of course go from 0 to 100, and you can see for some sample countries, Somalia is practically close to 0. And then the kind of middle range ones like Pakistan, Russia, China is 40. India is actually 51. Now I'm a little bit surprised it's as high as that. Even the US is only 9/10 of the way to perfection. Scandinavian countries are pretty high up, and within them, just by a hair, Denmark comes out at the top. And so if you remember your Shakespeare, Hamlet, things have changed since that time, and now there's nothing rotten in the state of Denmark. But you'll see a very wide range here that governance is quite imperfect in a lot of countries. But even countries with pretty weak governance, and you'll see that they're mostly either less developed countries or transition economies, they do attract a lot of foreign direct investment. And here is some data on that, going from 1990 to 2010. Year-by-year numbers for the world total vary quite widely. So these are just meant to be a rough indicator. I'll try and go a little bit farther and do 5-year averages in the written version of the lecture. But this will give you an idea that the percent of world foreign direct investment inflows that are going to developing countries have been rising and quite substantial. And likewise, the transition economies also are quite significant and actually growing. So somehow or the other, the problems of governance that I was talking about do get solved to some extent. And of course, the reason is that there's too much money on the table. Both the firms that are investing and the countries in which they are investing stand to lose a lot if the governance problem remains unsolved. And so they try and devise various ways in which at least partial solutions to governance problems can be obtained. This is a very standard story in problems of opportunism and moral hazard, that before the fact, all the parties stand to gain by solving those problems. It's only after the fact, after they enter into the relationship, that one party, or maybe both parties, will try and cheat on what they had just agreed and try and get advantage themselves at the expense of their partner. So, what kind of things do they do? And I give a few examples of those. One is that the firms can choose the mode in which they invest to try and overcome problems of governance. So, if contract enforcement is weak, they can use vertical integration. They can have a wholly owned subsidiary out in the country and basically try and replace external contracts by internal governance. So in this sense, this part you might almost think of as Williamson operating across international boundaries, overcoming opportunism by choosing vertical integration. Both of these parties can use an intermediary that's got a relationship with both parties. And perhaps the best example of that was the way in which Hong Kong operated for many, many years, basically through the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, where they were able to deal with Western investors on a standard kind of Western governance basis. They were able to deal with Chinese manufacturers on a basis of relationship. They knew them, had ongoing contacts with them, etc., etc. So repeated game type solutions could be obtained. And they were able to then channel funds from Western investors to Chinese manufacturers, acting as intermediaries and making profits from both. Similar kind of things were done, for example, prominently by the Morgans between Europe and the US in the late 19th, early 20th century. There are various ways in which the country receiving the investment, or the firms in the country receiving the investment, can give hostages. So they may have assets in Western countries that they effectively put up as a hostage while getting the investment. And if the investment gets badly treated, either expropriated or contract not honored, then the Western firms who make that investment will be able to have recourse in their own court to try and seize those assets. So that's the shelling type solution of giving the hostage as a credible commitment to behave well in the contractual relationship. And this has been formalized quite a bit in the form of what are called bilateral investment treaties, or BITs. There are now something like 3,000 almost separate treaties between countries that stand to receive such investments and have weak governance, and countries from which such investments come. And what the countries commit themselves to is that disputes will go to arbitrations in forums that are mostly in the investing firms' countries. Things like the London or the Paris or the Stockholm arbitration tribunals, or the similar other ones. And commit their courts to abide by the verdicts of these tribunals, not to retry. Now, how credible this is a little bit doubtful. But people who look at this say they work reasonably well in various ways. In fact, some of them are worried that, in fact, foreign investors are actually getting an even better deal than domestic investors in these countries. But the hope is that the domestic firms will then try and pressure their governments into improving the treatment of their own firms, and it will improve governance overall. Remains to be seen. But this is one of the things that at least lawyers who talk about this issue quite like. So there are these various ways, and economists have studied foreign direct investment in various kinds of investing country and receiving country setting. I want to talk a little bit about that and a little bit more about the data and develop the theory a little bit further for a specific kind of situation. If you look at the economics literature, much of it more or less supposes that foreign direct investment comes from a firm that's located in an advanced country, northern country. Actually, in this context, north and south are not geographic labels. They're words that denote the kind of level of development of the country. So if you like, in this context, Russia is south and Australia is north. By the way, completely incidentally, talking of north and south, I don't know if people realize that today is the 100th anniversary of the day on which Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, reached the South Pole. So this is a very southern day. The usual assumption is that the multinational corporation that makes the investment is a northern firm. And its advantage in making the investment, typically in a southern country, is its superior R&D, superior technology, or superior management. I mean, those people, after all, have MBAs from the Harvard Business School and things like that. Right? The country in which they're investing, the host country, the southern country, will usually have a cost advantage, low-cost labor or other things, and it's better able to go in for relatively low-tech production. The problem with both of these is that they are supposed to be not contractible, in the sense that if you sell managerial services, how well can the firm that's receiving managerial services be able to judge their quality? Or if you're selling technology, if you're licensing technology to a foreign firm, you can't very easily control whether they will then appropriate and misuse that technology, for example, produce things on the side and export back to your own country to compete with you. These things will be very difficult to litigate in a court of law because information that's necessary to demonstrate to the court of law that infractions have occurred are very hard to come by. So the thing as the jargon has it, the terms of the contract are very often not verifiable to a court of law. And it's the non-verifiability that's usually supposed to make them non-contractable. Same kind of non-contractability might also exist in the thing that the southern firm is, the southern country is providing, the labor services it provides might have problems with those about quality, all those kinds of things. And then because of this non-contractability, in the transaction cost economics type setting, it becomes desirable to think of internal governance, vertical integration typically, replacing licensing or export in order to save on transaction costs, even though manufacturing costs might be higher. And the multinational corporation looks at the balance of these things, and whichever it is that turns out to be the less cost method in a particular use, it will employ. But certainly it's possible that FDI will come about, and then the volume and form of FDI have been related to exactly these kind of things. The degree of verifiability, the degree of contractibility. But it's almost always supposed that FDI goes from north to south, also from north to north in various kind of ways that intra-industry trade occurs, there is also intra-FDI. But if you look at stories of FDI in the news, you'll often see something very different. A lot of very successful, newsworthy examples of investments have been from southern countries, again in my economic development and governance sense, not geographic sense, to other southern countries and also to several northern countries. In fact, those are the ones that get a lot of highlight treatment in the media, like Lenovo buying IBM's PC division, Tata buying Jaguar, Bilateral investing in European steel industries, and all the things of that kind, and actually in many cases making a better success of them than the original owners were doing. So we need to see how important this actually is. I mean, news headlines are all very well, but we should look a little bit at statistics to see whether this is a significant factor, and then ask if in fact investment from the South is an important thing. Can the standard kind of theory that I had on the last page, unchanged, explain it, or are we going to need something? So here's a little bit of data, similar to that I had a little while ago for inflows, now for outflows. By the way, if you go back to the table that I had and look at the world total outflows and compare them to the world total inflows, they don't match. And for people who look at this kind of data, that shouldn't be a surprise. Similar things happen for trade and all kinds of things. And usually it's a matter of exactly when things get reported as going out or coming in. The calendar year very often over the process, or the flow very often process a calendar year, so it will get reported as an outflow in one year and inflow the following year, or things of that kind. It's not that we are investing in Mars or Mars is investing in us, so ignore those little bit of discrepancies. And look at investment coming from developing countries. Again, fairly substantial, and by now actually quite large, as much as a quarter of flows. And from transition funds. Again, they're a smaller total, but they're also growing quite fast. A few other facts. There's an excellent complete survey of FDI from certain countries in the UNCTAD World Investment Review 5 years ago. There should be another one soon, but it had some useful numbers. So the flows in that year, according to them, were 17% of world FDI flows, and stock was only 13%. And so as flow is greater than stock, the flow is rising, and we actually saw that in the table before. The second thing, there's a whole lot of kind of regional concentration. So Eastern Europe got a lot of investment that mostly came from Russia, and a lot of other South investment, East-to-East investment, etc. And finally, the sheer number of southern multinationals was 26% of the total of world multinationals, and that's much bigger than either the stock or the flow. What that means is that southern multinationals are quite substantially smaller on the average. Investment into at least a prominent set of southern countries, and I didn't really have a good name for them, but these are basically going from China in the east to Southern Asia, India, Pakistan, etc. in the south. And so I call them the Asian Arc countries. If the name catches on, you heard it here first. So after investment, actually 2/3 comes from LDCs, other LDCs, and actually pretty substantially from other countries in a similar kind of region. So there's a lot of kind of regional concentration of FDI. Likewise, investment into Latin American countries comes quite substantially from other Latin American countries, and likewise in East Europe and Russia. Overall, my inference is that this is quite a substantial phenomenon. Investment coming from southern countries and into other southern countries, and we should take it seriously. We should look at its causes and possibly think in terms of new explanations that might help. Again, the laser pointer somehow doesn't seem to be working, but I don't think that's a big deal. The phenomenon had caught attention of various observers quite early, and there are two prominent books written on this by Theodore Wells of the Harvard Business School and Sanjay Lal and co-authors at Oxford, India, and various other places. And they observed several things about southern multinationals. One was that they're smaller in size on the average, as we saw above. Their technologies and management are better adapted to the local conditions than those of northern multinationals. They have developed better skills for managing the kind of low-skilled workers that they'll meet in the host countries. They're more likely to engage in joint ventures with local partners. They're more likely to bribe local officials. Now, of course, firms from the north have twofold problems. One is that their own country's laws very often prohibit bribery of foreign officials also, and they're under a lot of pressure from non-governmental organizations, etc., to operate clean systems, not pay bribes, pay fair wages, all those kind of things. But secondly, they don't have a great deal of experience bribing in their own country. Bribery is a bit of a skill. You don't just go up to an official and say, how much do you want for this license? You need to develop something of a relationship to the point that he trusts you not to turn into the authorities. You need to trust him. And the kind of work that's needed, very often firms from northern, squeaky clean, Scandinavian particularly countries just don't have. A lot of investment that came from the south used to be in resource-based industries or agriculture type activities, but they've been broadening substantially since. Okay, what kind of explanations that have been offered for southern FDI? And a lot of them are not mutually exclusive. In any particular situation, several of them will be operating, but anyway, here they are. Wells and Lal particularly emphasize the first two. And they are, first of all, that if governance in your own country is very bad, then that makes it a good idea to try and invest your profits, not in your own country, but elsewhere. So, of course, within your own country, you can have family firms or conglomerates that essentially act as internal governance mechanisms. But if you're accumulating a whole lot of profits, then partly an outlet for them would be to invest them abroad. Sometimes, particularly in the 60s, etc., a number of Indian firms in particular were actually invited by African firms to come and invest. And this was something like anti-colonial sentiment in those countries that preferred to have nice fellow southern country rather than more investment from these imperialists. So that worked to some extent. I don't think that's particularly important now, but in the early stages it was. A lot of southern firms invest in northern countries to acquire technology. A lot of Chinese investment in Africa particularly has been to acquire rights to natural resources, mineral resources. And in some cases, again, China is an example, India to some extent is another example. Governments in those countries subsidize, encourage investments abroad exactly for the purpose of acquiring technology or acquiring natural resources. Of course, in a kind of clean economic world, this would happen only to the extent that there is an externality, only to the extent that the benefit to the nation as a whole from acquiring that technology by its firm exceeds the profit that the firm stands to make itself, because otherwise the firm has exactly the right incentive and no subsidy is necessary. But the world is not all that clean, and governments very often have a kind of national pride or stake or what have you, and will encourage subsidized investment to get technology, even if there isn't any kind of additional benefit to be had. So all of those things that are laid out do have, in various examples, various instances, some role to play. But I want to talk about an additional hypothesis. And again, I want to emphasize that I do not mean this to replace the others or be better than others. All of them operate, many of them operate, and this is meant to be an additional one, which is that if in the target country, the host country, economic governance is bad, that itself creates a problem of contractibility. That's additional to the usual problems created by information. I mean, the usual story of information is that you write a contract, and if its terms are verifiable and the contract is violated, you go to the court and the court will enforce the contract. But what if the court itself is either completely missing or biased or corrupt or just plain slow? So for example, there is scuttlebutt that Indian courts are so backlogged that a commercial dispute, contract dispute, newly filed, will come up for a hearing in 350 years' time. Now that's not entirely true. Lawyers have ways of cutting through all those processes, but it's still pretty bad. And if that's the case, then a formal contract might as well not exist. And some advantage goes to a firm that is capable of replacing the formal contract by other forms of things. And in that context, southern multinational firms, I want to argue, have an advantage. Various ways in which that advantage manifests itself. As we saw, Lau, Wells, etc. found that these firms had technology that was better adapted to conditions of poor governance, to dealing with firms that had low skill, labor that had low skills, and other things of that kind. Again, as I mentioned before, they know the importance of developing relationships, using relationship-based governance. Do that to work their way around a variety of regulatory obstacles, a variety of officials who need palm greasing, etc. for issuing those licenses. They have experience of doing that in their own country. Of course, conditions differ from country to country, and you'll need to go through some basis to establish specific relationships in the other country, but at least you know the importance of doing that. You will not barge in write a contract and try and operate with that. They're more used to bribery, they have more experience in it, they have less qualms about it, they're less restricted by their home country laws or other things. And in the context of regional concentration that I mentioned, an important aspect is that they already have some networks in the other country. Those may be ethnic networks, they may be linguistic networks, they may be cultural networks, but they already have some access to relationship-based governments in the target country. I want to give you some evidence in support of this argument, and it comes from a mixture of sources, not a kind of single regression that will clinch the issue and I can go on, but I want to gradually kind of build up your belief that there's something here. So the importance of Chinese ethnic networks has been demonstrated quite a lot. James Rauch had a very nice survey of this a little while ago. There's work done by Chinese scholars as well, of whom I mentioned one, Simon Fan, in the Journal of Contemporary China. The use of Hong Kong as an intermediary I mentioned. There's a very nice paper by Li and Lian that explains how this worked in detail. The kind of things that Chinese multinationals did when investing abroad has been looked at and demonstrated, how they used cultural links, but also links of operations in socialist systems. So when they're investing in Russia and Vietnam, they knew that these countries were just coming off of their socialist periods, and a lot of those officials were still there. They know how those officials operate, in what kind of language, as it were, to talk to them, how to work through the system. And this paper by Chen and Lin demonstrates how that was done. By the way, the detailed references to all these are in the written paper, of which I had sent an early draft, but I'll, of course, write up the final version. It will be published then in the standard web lecture series, and you will be able to get more details of this. Recently, I came across another one. Actually, I forgot to give the exact site, but this is a PhD thesis by Peter Seitz at Yale, who looked at textile firms operating in China in the 1920s and 30s. So my story kind of goes way back. There are Japanese firms and there are British firms. If you looked at their productivity in their home countries, the British firms were more productive. They were able to produce the same output with less labor than Japanese firms, less other things as well. But in China, the Japanese firms had substantially higher productivity. And the problem was that the technology was not well adapted for the British firms. They operated using a decentralized system that relied a lot on middle-level supervisors, foremen. And of course, they employed foremen in China who colluded with the workers, who filched some materials, output, etc., etc. The Japanese, who had to work with somewhat similar kind of things at home, had a much more centralized system. They monitored everything, they used middle-level supervisors that they brought from home, and it turned out to be just better suited to the local conditions. So the kind of thing that I was mentioning about southern firms, and in the 1920s Japan was still part of the South, had technology and management systems that were simply much better adapted to local conditions. Then there are some econometric studies. And there are a couple of these studies that have looked at the effects of bad governance on foreign direct investment volumes. And they're negative, just no doubt. The country that's got bad governance, other things equal, attracts less FDI. but the effect is less negative if the country from which the investment comes also has bad governance. So there is an interaction between governance in the two countries that has the sign of making it less negative. What kind of things are investing firms worried about? Well, you would be worried about economic fundamentals, and you would be worried about political risk, country risk in investing in a country. So Wang finds that within the region, investors in the East and Southeast Asian region are less worried by political risk. They are relatively more sensitive to economic fundamentals, and the natural reason is that they are better able to cope with the political risk. Okay, so I hope I've argued that there's something in the hypotheses that I'm advocating. Now, of course, I'm an economist, and I would be stripped of my officer's epaulets or whatever if I didn't want to present a model. So for those of you who are not economists, I apologize, and I hope that the model is simple enough that you will not be worried by it. So think of one particular firm investing in one particular country, F investing, coming from country O, investing in country H. So there are two things that are relevant here. One is specific to firm F, and that is how much excessive technology it has, how close its technology is to being well adapted to a country in which it's proposing investment. That's it. And R is an inverse measure of the quality of governance in country H. So R stands for rotten. R equals 0 is close to Denmark. R equal 1, if you like, is close to Somalia. Now, F has got three choices. Either stay out completely, call it G, enter into a joint local venture with a local partner, that's J, and enter as a wholly owned subsidiary or vertical integration. If it does enter, it will get revenues RV from the V mode, RJ from the J mode, and since it doesn't have to share with a local partner, the natural supposition is that RV is bigger than RJ. What about costs? There's some kind of fundamental cost fees here that would be if the home country had perfect governance and you went in with perfect technology. But then there are costs of coping with governance, C times R, and costs of having inappropriate technology that you've got to adapt, that's A times T. And they're different depending on what kind of mode you use. If you use a local partner, the local partner is better able to cope with governance than you directly are. So CJ is less than CV, and will help you adapt the technology, knows how things operate, etc. So AJ is less than AP. But of course the problem with bad governance is that then the local partner may steal your technology. So there's a potential technology leakage cost, LJ, that you've got to take into account if you operate in the J mode, and that will be higher both if manufacturer using it and then ship back to your own country. So that I take to be proportional to the product of R&D. Now those specific forms, the linear form for those costs and the product for the leakage cost is not so important. Qualitative results will be similar with more general forms. So you look to see which mode is best, and you do that by first of all drawing where profits from the V mode are 0. That's the big line that goes down there, equal 1. To its right, when governance is bad and technology is not well suited, pi V will be negative, below it pi V will be positive. Same kind of thing for pi j, that's the shallower curve, above it pi j is negative. V is equal to pi j. Above it, your technology is too bad and might get stolen. So pi j will be bigger, sorry, pi v will be bigger. Below it, pi j will be bigger. And so these three lines then split the whole RT space into three regions, which are demarcated by the thick lines. One to the left is where V is best, the one below is where J is best, and the one above where staying out is best. So that's for one specific firm and one specific country. Now, all the country is the same, the destination country, and try and compare Fs coming from two different home countries, a north one and a south one. They typically differ in the specification of these costs. So it may be that if the southern firm is better at coping with governance on its own, CV will be lower for the southern firm than for the northern firm. So what happens if CV is lower? What happens is that the pi v equals 0 line swings out, what was previously unprofitable becomes profitable, and the pi j equal pi v line swings down because v now has a better performance possibility in relation to j. So the kind of triangular strip that I've marked here is where Z was profitable before, staying out was profitable, G is profitable now. And if that's the north-south distinction, you'll see some southern firms come in with wholly owned subsidiaries in that strip, whereas northern firms would have stayed out. And down there, where northern firms would have operated with joint ventures, southern ones would come in with wholly owned subsidiaries. What if the advantage comes from using the local partner, so that it's CJ that's lower for the southern firm? Then the pi j equals 0 curve swings out, and the pi j equal pi v curve swings out. So where a southern firm can operate with J, a northern firm would have operated with V. And whereas in that strip to the right there, where the northern firm would have stayed out, a southern firm would come in with local partners. So in the situations where the kind of thing that Wells and Lau observed, that southern firms are relatively more likely to do joint ventures, this picture fits the bill better. That southern firms are more likely to come in at all with joint ventures and do joint ventures instead of wholly owned subsidiaries. In other cases where northern firms are not so well able to cope with governance in southern countries directly, where southern firms are, this kind of picture might work. And since those pictures work in different regions of the RT space, we'll have a little sharper hypothesis that given sufficient data that kind of is just becoming available, we can test. We'll be able to see under what circumstances the one operates, under what countries the one operates, etc. And so what I hope is that this kind of modeling will in the future, given better data, better econometric techniques, etc., will pave the way for more equitable work. So I hope I've convinced you that investment from southern countries is a substantial phenomenon. It's a growing phenomenon. It involves somewhat new ideas, somewhat new reasons. It's capable of being thought about both in theoretical terms and ultimately, hopefully, tested empirically. And most importantly, you need to recognize the interaction between governance in the two countries in doing this kind of work. I hope some people will get interested doing this kind of empirical work, the data gathering, the processing, etc., is not at all either my absolute advantage or comparative advantage. Russ mentioned I've never done any time series econometrics, I've never done any cross-section econometrics either. So I offer that in the end as possibly good thesis topic for graduate students and maybe even faculty among you. So thank you very much for listening.